So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schrad in just a second. I'll introduce him first. Dr. Mark Schrad is a professor of political science and director of Russian area studies at Villanova University. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the author of 3 books with Oxford University Press, including Vodka Politics, Alcohol Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State, which has been translated into a half-dozen world languages. His most recent book, which we have on sale out in the gift shop, is Smashing the Liquor Machine, A Global History of Prohibition. And that has been awarded a coveted Kirkus-starred review and is the winner of the Francesco Guicciardini Prize for the best book in historical international relations from the International Studies Association. And with that, I give you Dr. Mark Schrad.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mabel. This is great. It's such a great turnout, such a great room, such a great sound system. You have to go with that, right? So yeah, I gotta set this alarm. I could talk forever if I don't keep a tight leash on it and whatnot. So thank you for having me out. This is a great opportunity, hopefully, to talk a little bit about the book and tie it in a little bit to Southeastern PA history and everything we've got going on here. Just by way of introductions and ground rules, sometimes I feel like it's useful to kind of give you some ideas as to where I'm coming from, because a lot of people, if left to their own devices, make up their own minds as to what my I guess ideas are or motivations are like. And so as Mabel said, I'm a professor of political science and director of Russian area studies. I do a lot of teaching on everything: comparative politics, international relations, international law, international organizations, Russia, Ukraine, all sorts of stuff like that, right? So one of the things you'll note is that some of the things that are missing from that is American history, not even part of it, right? So, and I'll try to explain how this whole thing kind of comes about here. But it's a very lonely place to be. There's not, because I'm in the political science department, and I find myself oftentimes being the only quote unquote political scientist at conferences full of historians. And the difference is not so much one of interest. My interests are very much in history, right? It's more of a methodological approach. And since I speak through anecdotes, I'll just give you a quick example. Again, studying Russian history, for a long time, I guess before I moved out here to Villanova, I spent 3 years at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And one of the guys, these great historians, is this guy named Mark Steinberg. He's since retired. He's kind of the ultimate consummate historian of the Russian Revolution. And I was like, okay, that's great. I've got a chapter that I was, in that's now in this book, which is my second book, called Vodka Politics. And I wanted to essentially make this argument as to the degree to which alcohol prohibition in Russia sort of facilitated the Bolshevik Revolution. That was one of the things that caused it. And I was like, oh, I can't let this moment go. We've got this guy who's like the consummate historian of the Russian Revolution. I invited him out for a drink, after class, if we can talk one time. He was very gracious about it. So we went down to the pub, had a couple of beers, and at some point, kind of popped out my pen. I was like, okay, you're the scholar, you're the historian. You know everything there is to know about the Russian Revolution. What is the state of the art on what caused the Russian Revolution? And I got my notepad out, ready to take notes. And he looks at me and he just laughs. Very nice guy. He wasn't being offensive anyway. And he goes, Mark, nobody in history has asked that question in 40 years. What causes a revolution? No, he's like, that's for political scientists to do. You do causation. You ask those big questions. He's like, what is cutting edge in history about the Russian Revolution is like, what was it like to be a worker in Petrograd in 1914? That kind of very fine-grained history. He's like, we don't ask the big how and the big why questions. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? Because those are the things that to me are very, very interesting. Why do these things happen? I'm not, so I spend a lot of time in archives, but I'm always asking these sort of big questions, the big how and why questions of causation. And the other thing that kind of comes of this is kind of this focus on sort of social science methodologies, right? So hypothesis testing, trying to, if you have a question of what's causing what, well, you have to bring evidence to bear on that. And if it's not borne out by the evidence, well, then you have to dismiss that hypothesis, right? And so, so applying that to historical questions is, again, sort of conventional historians don't really think about these things in those sorts of terms. And so a lot of it is premised around questions of research design, like how do you go about, sampling, right? Like you wouldn't go and try to figure out who's going to win the 2024 election by doing a sample of your neighbors or like, your crazy uncle, right, as to who they're going to vote for, because that's not representative, right? You want a large representative sample. And the bigger the sample size, the more, you're assured that, your results are more robust, more generalizable, right? And so that's kind of how I approach this question of prohibition, is that we have this question of what caused prohibition, but pretty much every study that you have is based on a single case study, and that's the United States. And then we try to take that information and kind of project it onto the rest of the globe in ways that it doesn't really work. And that's kind of where I've come into this this whole thing here. The other thing I'll mention, doing sort of political science, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what goes into that. But I will just put it out there. I have no political agenda to reflect on current day left-right politics. And the nice thing about studying politics and history in an objective manner is that you have to back up your assertions with evidence, from primary sources, secondary sources. You have to have different types of data to support it. And ideally, your findings, should resonate. They should be robust, regardless of whether the researcher is, lefty, righty, Republican, Democrat, whether the audience is left, right. It should withstand because it's backed by evidence. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff. I'll use terminology about liberals, Democrats, conservatives, all these terms. And if that resonates with you, that's great. If it doesn't, that's on you. That's not on me, right? So it's just kind of this description of what's going on there. And so finally, the last thing I'll just mention is, like, it seems like a very weird thing to have a guy who's talking about Russian area studies, who grew up in the Cold War and was kind of obsessed with the Soviet Union, and also talking about temperance. And I think the bind that is between those is that it's kind of like a forbidden fruit, because growing up in the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviets, those are the bad guys, those are the villains of global history. But if you look at American history, the temperance movement is really kind of these villains, right? Because we have this idea that they're there to take away our freedom, and that's fundamentally un-American, right? So it kind of is opposite to our own perceptions of what's out there. So so that's kind of where I'm coming at with this this research. So just kind of getting that out of the way in terms of the ground rules. And so I, for the longest time I grew up, and kind of had this appreciation of American history in particular, looking at the Constitution. I saw the Constitution, in high school and I guess middle school and so on. Just saw it as kind of like the embodiment of the received wisdom of generations of Americans, right? You start off with your Bill of Rights. It's a good start, right? It's not everything. So we got to fix it, right? You got to fix these things. 13th Amendment, no slavery. Okay, that makes sense. You're kids studying these things. It makes a lot of sense. 14th Amendment, equal protection. Okay, 15th Amendment going on. And then, you get down to 18th Amendment, thou shalt not sell drink, and you're like, what? That doesn't make any sense at all. What? Okay, whatever. Okay, 19th Amendment, women can vote, going on. Okay, this makes sense. Now, 21st Amendment, remember that 18th? Forget it, or just erase it, right? And so I was like, what happened there? What was this all about? And it didn't make any sense to me then as a kid. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so trying to figure out how to make it make sense is part of it. And so if you read a lot of the history literature on prohibition and prohibitionism, on that question of what causes prohibition, it kind of, sort of the state of the art explanations boils down to this one word, white lash. And I stole that word from 2016, when the election results came in 2016 and Donald Trump won. You had, I was watching, I think it was on CNN or something like that, and Van Jones got up there and he says, what we've witnessed is a white lash. It is a conservative reaction against the pressures of modernization and immigration. that's what you've seen today. And I was like, well, I don't know about that, but that is a perfect encapsulation of what we used to say caused prohibition. They say, well, look, you have these crazy evangelical zealots like Carrie Nation with her hatchet and her Bible telling you what you can and cannot drink, right? That it was they say it was a symbolic crusade. There was a book called Symbolic Crusade of white, rural, nativist, reactionary evangelicals against sort of the pressures of increased modernization and immigration. And they say, well, it was a movement to discipline the leisure of minorities and immigrants and so on. And so you get this image of, these Bible thumpers who are out there sort of legislating morality and are fundamentally opposed to your freedom to make your own decisions as to drink. And they say, well, this is, it kind of has people try to make this like a red line. They say, you can go back to the old, the old Puritans through, sort of this red line of intolerance through temperance, through sort of the anti-abortion movements, also, right through to the present day. These are some of the arguments that are out there that I fundamentally disagree with because they're not supported by evidence. And they say, well, this is fundamentally an American phenomenon. And I said, okay, well, looking at some of my previous research, this is based on my first book, The Political Power of Bad Ideas, in which prohibition is the bad idea. And I was like, okay, well, this might make sense. This explanation of like a culture clash narrative might make sense here in the United States, even if we buy that assumption, right? But it doesn't explain why you have prohibition in all these other countries in red. If you had it for a time in Canada, you had it in Imperial Russia, you had it in the Middle East, most of Africa, you had prohibition all at the exact same time, right around World War I. That's interesting. And it also doesn't explain why you had sort of an internationally linked temperance movement in all the countries in red, and the countries in orange were instituting anti-alcohol restrictions as opposed to loosening restrictions. They're all kind of moving in that same direction. That's interesting as well. And then all the countries in red and orange and yellow are kind of all linked through this transnational temperance movement of like-minded individuals. And so I was like, this is very bizarre, that if you kind of broaden out and look, beyond the United States, you see that there's a lot more stuff going on here. And so that became sort of the challenge of my first book. It's an awful book, by the way. It was my dissertation. It reads like a dissertation. My wife loves me. She can't even get through one chapter of it. It's awful. So don't ever get it. Anyway, so you had 12 other countries that were involved in this. And so if you get into it, you find that temperance was actually one of the most successful, the broadest international transnational advocacy network or social movement. But also it kind of raises questions about that whole culture clash narrative of what causes temperance and prohibitionism. Because again, if your explanation as to what causes prohibition is about Bible thumping Midwestern evangelicals, well, how do you explain Russia being the first prohibition country? They don't have Bible thumping Midwestern evangelicals. They don't even have a Midwest, right? They don't have evangelicals. So what's going on? There's something else going on here. And it also made me wonder to what degree that explanation held water, even in the United States, right? How is it that you say, okay, well, it was really a culture clash of, rural conservatives versus immigration, modernization. Okay, that doesn't tell us anything about how you get that policy enacted or how you get an amendment put into the Constitution. How does that work? How do you go from culture to politics? It's never really clear. It's just kind of people just kind of throw their hands up and imagine that there's some sort of causal mechanism there. But also you look at some of these organizations that you have in American history, like, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, right? The WCTU. And so if you understand prohibition to be like a fundamentally conservative, reactionary movement, the WCTU doesn't make any sense. The Women's Christian Temperance Movement is simultaneously promoting something that is very progressive, women's suffrage, and very reactionary at the same time in prohibition. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And they're involved in the abolitionist movement, and they're involved in sort of, the international labor movement, socialism, and so on. So that doesn't make any sense. And the idea is that, well, if prohibition was all about, conservative, reactionary Bible thumpers, Why was there no sort of religious great awakening, in the early 1920s? Actually, if you look, the enrollments in churches were going down dramatically at this point in time. People were becoming less active in religious organizations. So that doesn't make any sense either, right? And in particular, if we look at the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the Prohibition Amendment as kind of like the crowning achievement of prohibitionism, how is it that this reactionary movement got its single greatest legislative achievement in the height of the so-called progressive era? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? So how does any of this work? The more you think about it, the less it makes sense. And especially it makes even less sense if you get online and go on like Twitter and try to see people's kind of, armchair history reactions about it. One of the funniest ones that I always get all the time is that, it's temperance and prohibitionism was a women's movement. And that's why, especially, sort of the men that you get on Twitter, they say, well, we gave women the right to vote. And the very first thing that they did was institute prohibition and take away your freedom to drink. I was like, okay. But here's the thing is that 18 comes before 19, right? The 18th Amendment came before the 19th Amendment. That's how numbers work, right? And so you're completely backwards on all this. So like there's so much baggage about like what we're taught, from sort of just the conventional wisdom about prohibition that doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. But the one thing that I will highlight that kind of is, if there's a secret key that unlocks prohibition history, it's the terminology that they use. And if you go back, and you can do this now with Google books and stuff like that, you can look at sort of the usage of different phrases over time. Back in the 1800s and even beforehand, people didn't talk about alcohol prohibition. That's kind of the stock phrase we use nowadays, alcohol prohibition. They never said alcohol prohibition. They said prohibition of the liquor traffic. And that was the thing. And so I was like, that seems like a very small difference, alcohol or liquor. And actually, prohibition was mostly focused on distilled liquors rather than, it wasn't so much about beer and wine. They kind of get swept into it later on. But mostly it was about liquor, but it was about the trafficking in liquor. That's a big distinction, because liquor is one thing. Liquor is the stuff in the bottle, right? And that's, it has addictive properties, right? It has dopamine and stuff, and it makes you, addicted and whatnot. But the traffic is the key to this, because traffic is, trafficking is making money off of a commodity, making money off of things. And so you could be a prohibitionist, you could be against the liquor traffic, but not necessarily be against alcohol. And that seems like a contradiction in terms, and I'm going to hope to try to unpack some of that. But think about it this way, I think human trafficking is bad. It's a bad thing to buy and sell people, as chattel slavery or anything like that, right? But even though I'm against human trafficking, doesn't mean that I'm against human beings. The human is different from the traffic, and just like this, the liquor is different from the traffic. And I think that's something that people tend to overlook as really kind of the key to this whole thing here. So, just checking the time here, make sure we're on chat. So here's I want to give you a quick layout of the book just to show you kind of how this thing goes. And so I had to kind of, we had some technical difficulties. I had this very nice animated thing, but I'll just have to use the PowerPoint here. So introductory chapter just kind of gives us a layout of the book. It's an academic book. It's not like one of these whodunits where I kind of spring the conclusions on you at the very end. I had the whole thing kind of packaged in the introduction, where we talk a little bit about Carrie Nation, and how we misunderstand Carrie Nation as an individual is the same way that we misunderstand the entire prohibitionist movement. And so then I start to go to all these different countries around the globe. And so I start off in Russia, in the Russian Empire. And so my level of analysis, my unit of analysis, I should say, is the empire. That was the era, we're in the age of empires. And so pretty much every chapter looks at one or two empires in comparative context. And so chapter 2, again, kind of focuses on Russia. It was kind of an outgrowth of this, my second book, which I mentioned before, is called Vodka Politics, Alcohol, Autocracy, and the Secret History of the Russian State. And so it's a drunk history of Russia. There are a lot of fun drunk stories, and There's that show on TV, Catherine the Great, or the Great. I don't know if you've seen that. A lot of that is actually based on reality. There's a lot of alcohol in Russia. That kind of goes without saying. But this book kind of looks at this question of why do we have that stereotype? Again, how and why questions. Why do we have that stereotype of the drunken Russian? Why do Russians drink so much? And why do they drink so much vodka in particular? Yada, 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 500 pages later. The answer to that, or the thesis of the book, is that, Russians don't necessarily have like some genetic predisposition towards vodka. It's not that they love it. Russians drink a shot of vodka the same way we would drink a shot of vodka. And that's like with a shiver and go, oh my God, it's awful. It's not like they're going, this is very smooth, right? No, and then you have to get like some dried fish and like try to gulp it down. It's awful. It's awful, right? But why do you do that? Why is that, right? And so people just kind of throw up their hands like, oh, it's culture. I'm like, no. Actually, it's the result of centuries and political and economic decisions that are at the heart of autocratic statecraft that kind of put the interests of the state and the czars back in the day, and their financial status ahead of the well-being of the population. And so going back to Ivan the Terrible, you had in Russia what they called the kabak system. It was the tavern system, where all of the revenues from the alcohol trade went to the imperial revenue, right? It was a monopoly, government monopoly on the alcohol trade. And so during the late 1800s in particular, something like 1/3 of all the revenue of the great Russian Empire came from selling vodka to their own people. And so at one point I gave a book talk on this to an international convention of experts in Russia, in Ivanova. So I lived in Russia for a time, and so I went and gave this talk in Ivanova. It's like a 6-hour drive outside of Moscow, and they wanted me to speak on it for 3 hours, which I did in Russian, which I thought was pretty good. So the Russian kind of comes and goes, I suppose, but I was able to hold my own for a while. But I figured that they would absolutely grill me, that they would hate this, that I'm saying, like airing people's dirty laundry. Why people drink so much is because your government is, has a profit motive in getting you addicted to stuff and then bleeding you dry. Don't you find that really bad? And a lot of them were like, meh. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean, meh? Meh is not a good answer to this. He's like, well, if you go back 100 years ago, before income taxes, most countries on earth got most of their revenues from liquor taxes. And I said, oh, I should probably look into that. And that's when this book got born, right? And so I was like, okay, I'm going to look at this in international context, right? So anyway, so chapter 2 looks at Russia. I know I want to get to some of these other ones. Chapter 3 looks next door at the Swedes and also the Social Democrats. The other thing I wanted to do in this is not only get a broad sample, right, global sample of experiences. I also wanted to get a sample of different, let's call them isms, right, different ideologies. And so in the Russian Empire, I look at temperance and anti-authoritarian communism, because you find that some of the biggest temperance advocates in Russia were people that you might know. People like Leo Tolstoy back in the day. So it was kind of this Christian anarchist at the point. And then the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, well, they were prohibitionists. They understood, because they were against the traffic, that alcohol in Russia was how the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And so if you wanted to strike a blow against this class-based system, you stop drinking. You're stopping that sort of cooperation with the government. And so it starts with, again, Russia and looking at anti-authoritarian communism. Next door, it goes into temperance and social democracy in Sweden and in Belgium. And then the third chapter looks at, fourth chapter goes into sort of the continental empires, looks at liberalism and temperance in the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you had people like Tomas Masaryk, who's kind of the George Washington of Czechoslovakia, sort of the founding father of Czechoslovakia. And he was fighting for the freedom and the right of self-determination of the Czech people, but he also understood that you cannot be enlightened if everybody's drunk all the time, right? So we need to have responsible people who can understand the weight of responsibility of voting and everything that's kind of associated with that. So that's 4, 5. Then it goes into the second section of the book, which is all about the British Empire. And so chapter 5 is a really long chapter. And for lack of a better term, it's about sort of the white overseas British Empire. So we look at relations between England and Scotland, England and Ireland. There's some interesting temperance things. We associate the Irish with drinking a lot, but actually, around the 1840s, this movement by Father Theobald Matthew, you had 1/3 of all Irishmen were card-carrying members of temperance organizations. Blows your mind in some of these cases. And so it looks at some of those, looks at Canada, looks at Australia, New Zealand in that way. Chapter 6, and I'll go into some greater detail here in a minute, looks at South Africa, colonial South Africa, in sort of these dynamics between sort of the colonizer and the colonized. And the same sort of thing that you have in Chapter 7 looks at the British Raj in India, where you have, in that same sort of way, you have the leaders of the sort of the Indian National Congress, guys like Mahatma Gandhi, were prohibitionists, and not because they were just on religious or moral grounds. It was part of their non-cooperation. The idea was that the British come here and they encourage us to drink alcohol. They're the ones who make the profit from it as part of the liquor traffic, and we're the ones who end up being the drunken addicts. And so if we want to not cooperate with this whole dynamic, we should picket the British liquor stores. And that's one of the things that they did a lot, was a lot of the focus of non-cooperation in India was around liquor stores. And that kind of feeds into the same sort of thing. In the same way that you had sort of the opium wars in China, same dynamic. Like what opium did for China, you had the British carting it in, forcing it in, to essentially get people addicted for profit, is the same thing that you had in in India. It's what you had in a lot of these different areas. And so then finally, Chapter 8 kind of looks at the Ottoman Empire, and you figure it's a Muslim caliphate, right? That should be a really easy chapter to write about prohibition. Says it in the Quran, moving on, right? But actually, if you go into the history of it, especially if you get into to Turkey, you find that Kemal Ataturk, the nationalist leader of Turkey, was kind of fighting for an independent Turkey, was probably the drunkest leader in all of world history. The guy drank constantly. He died at like 53 of liver cirrhosis, just to give you an idea. So he drank heavily, but also they had a prohibition movement in that, despite the fact that this was during Kemal Ataturk's time, based on the same notion of who's benefiting. That it was in each of these cases you find the protest against the liquor traffic has a very sort of anti-imperial bent. It's all about who's benefiting for it. And so in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Turkey, prohibition was about, we're not going to get ourselves drunk and let all the profit go to the British or go to the Armenians were the other ones, or the Greeks. Those were the big three. And so it was about communal self-protection against colonization and colonial exploitation. Very progressive movement in all these cases. And that was the original plan. That was the intent of the book. I was not going to look at the United States. I was going to maybe have like one chapter that kind of says, okay, well, we learned something about the rest of the world. What can we apply to the United States? And so I gave a lecture in my department. And a colleague of mine, Jennifer Dixon, who's our expert, she does work on Japan and Turkey and sort of politics of memory. Incredible scholar, by the way. She says, okay, if I'm to believe your argument that temperance was not a reactionary movement, but a progressive, anti-colonial, anti-imperial movement, where are the Native Americans in your account? And I was like, you're right. They're not there. And so that was the question. That's the question where, this book went from 8 chapters to 18 chapters, and went from like 300 pages to 750 pages, and added 2 more years of research just based on that one question. Yep, you're right. And so what was fascinating is that if you take this perspective that we learn from the rest of the world and apply it to American history, suddenly all of American history opens up in ways that all of a sudden everything just kind of falls into place, right? And so you find that, for instance, the first prohibitionists in the United States were its first peoples, right? Native Americans across the board were prohibitionists. And we'll get into that here in a bit. I'll go into some greater detail. Just keeping an eye on the time here. So that's kind of the idea. This whole thing is, like I said, it got really unwieldy, and I apologize for what a big book it is. So this is based on a lot of primary source material, and did research in 14 different languages, drawn from 130 archival collections housed in 70 archives in 17 countries across 5 continents. And so there's a lot of research that goes into this. I think it's one of these things I should say. I found out a few years ago that I'm actually on the autism spectrum. And so like having this kind of obsessive need to document and substantiate every single claim, which is why there's like 500 pages of footnotes, because you have to substantiate everything that you do, right? So anyway, this question of what caused prohibition, it's one thing to kind of tear down pre-existing explanations. It's another one entirely to kind of put up your own. I found this phrase in studies of American sort of populism in sort of the Midwest, and they talked about this coalition of Marx, Jefferson, and Jesus. And I was like, I think that's a pretty good framework, right? So prohibitionism was a very progressive movement. It has some elements of class, protection to it. So again, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and then social democrats, and a lot of it was about making sure that trying to protect your poor community from essentially the ravages of unfettered capitalism. But there's also sort of the Jefferson, which is sort of the liberalism, right? That we have to have community enfranchisement, which is why temperance makes common cause with the abolitionist movement, the suffragist movement. As they've said, I guess all great reforms go together. That's what Frederick Douglass was famous for. So he says the three great reforms were abolitionism, suffragism, and temperance, because they were all about empowering people at the expense of those things that would keep you down. Whether that was slavery, whether that was disenfranchisement, or whether that was slavery to the so-called liquor traffic. That was the other one. And of course, Jesus, right? You can't deny that there is a moral element to these movements, and I try to weave that in various ways there. And so that's kind of the lay of the book there. But with the time that we have, I did want to hit on 2 individual case studies very, very quickly. And these are 2 that I was thinking about over the last couple of days that you probably would never think about in the same context. I want to talk about Botswana and Pennsylvania, Southeast Pennsylvania, and I want to compare those 2. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but hopefully it will in just a second. So actually, this book is a good book, but it's not the most read thing that I ever wrote. Probably the most read thing that I ever wrote was I decided back on Twitter. This is 2021. I wanted to see if I could make something go viral. Right? That sounds like fun. Let's try that. And so I put together like some of the insights from chapter 6, which is about Botswana, and put it into and it actually went viral. It got like over 1 million hits and stuff like that. So this is probably the most read thing that I've ever done. Was kind of this quick history of Botswana. So I had this animated, and so it doesn't quite work out as well as possible. So Botswana has been an independent country since 1966. It is. You don't hear a lot about it because it doesn't make a lot of noise. It's a very low population, very stable democracy in a region that's not particularly known for stable democracies, and is one of the more prosperous countries in Africa. And so if we want to understand how that came about, it's important to figure out what are the political origins of Botswana. And actually, it's all tied in. And my argument is that there would not be a country called Botswana if it weren't for prohibition. Again, weird claim. I'm going to try to back it up with evidence, right? So what's interesting about this, you have this this kind of playbook of what I call alco-colonization, right? You think about colonialism as sort of the expansion of European empires at the end of a gun. But I would argue that liquor in particular is just as important to sort of the colonial domination and subordination of these subaltern populations, whether that is native populations in Australia, in India, in Africa, North America. You see the same sort of playbook, right? And a lot of these native populations, because distilled liquors, right? Your whiskeys, your rums, your vodkas, right? These are industrial distillates. We only have this as a result of the Industrial Revolution, right? And so those are sort of European colonial export commodities. And especially, liquor is great because it doesn't spoil. It's very potent. You can, move it around fairly easily, and you can trade it, with people. And so that's became sort of the big thing about sort of international European exploration, was that you ended up having liquor with them all the time. And so when the European colonists, when they would come to South Africa or come to even, I guess, North America, like the first thing they would do is kind of a goodwill gesture, is introduce native populations to liquor, right? We're going to have fun. And so I gave a talk 2 weeks ago in New York City to a bunch of brewing CEOs. I was in Manhattan, and I was like, I can tell you the exact moment that liquor was introduced in the United States. It was September 11th, 1609. That's when Henry Hudson came up the Hudson, what is now known as Hudson River, drops anchor in Manhattan, I guess is what it now is, and introduced to the native populations alcohol. And they ended up calling the area where they had this meeting Manahatachuk in the indigenous language, which translates as the place where we all got drunk. Later on, they shortened it. It's now known as Manhattan, but Manhattan is the place where we all got drunk. And same sort of thing in all these other places as well, South Africa. And so what happens is that seems to be like the playbook that you have as part of colonialization, that you give indigenous populations alcohol, and not just, some of them may have had, histories of fermentation and brewing and so on. But this is distilled liquor. This is like of a potency that nobody had even envisioned at that point in time. And so what happens? You give people liquor, they enjoy it, they have fun, they get really drunk, and then bad things happen, right? You get murders, you get rapes, you get fires, you get arsons, and then all of a sudden, the sort of the white colonizers clutch their pearls and go, oh my gosh, they can't handle their liquor that we just gave them. That must be evidence of their lack of civilization. And that's the reason that we must have kind of this white man's burden to civilize all this. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of alco colonization. And so that's kind of the idea of what you have here. And so what's interesting about it, again, why alcohol becomes such an important part of this colonization process, is that it makes you, let's put it this way. So if you're a white trader and you're going to the central parts of Africa, right, and there are indigenous populations there that have stuff that you want to trade for, right? And what do they have? Well, I guess, in Africa, you've got a lot of ivory, right? They got food, furs in Northern America, ivory, ostrich feathers were a big one, rubber, ivory, the land, the minerals in it, ivory also was another big one. And also actually the people were commodities as well. So, and ivory was a big thing. So we got a lot of ivory. And so what happens? Okay, you've got something that I want, right? What do I have that I can trade for you, right? And so at that point in time, think about the things that you could have, the commodities that you could have. You could trade with a native population, a nice woolen blanket, and that would do them well. That will hold out for 5 years, maybe. They don't need you for another 5 years. Or trade like some nice iron pots so they can do some cooking, right? That pot's going to last them 20 years. They don't need you for another 20 years. But if you can introduce them to something that is highly potent and addictive that they don't know how to make, now they're coming back to you. You've gone from being completely marginal to that sort of ecosystem, that colonial sort of environment, and that colonial economy, to now you're indispensable to it. You have to be there. You are the sole drugs dealer to a community of junkies, and that's incredibly lucrative. And that's what you find in a lot of these instances. And so if you don't believe me, I think it's fascinating that I had this question up there of what was the first industry in the entire continent of Africa. And I've kind of just went straight to the answer here. It was this here. This is the first factory. It's called the Eerste Fabrieken in Dutch, down in the Orange Free State. It was a distillery, and it was a distillery not to not for the white colonizers, because they didn't drink liquor for the most part. They drank beer, and sort of the second industry was brewing to serve sort of the whites in these cases. But this was, to develop something that's highly potent to get people addicted, especially sort of the native Africans, so that they could go down into the mines and mine the diamonds and mine the gold and all the things that were, that South Africa is known for. And so that was sort of an interesting element there. So again, just kind of keeping an eye on the time. So chapter 6 is fascinating because in Botswana, or what at that point in time was known as Bechuanaland, was inhabited by a number of indigenous kings, they called them. And probably foremost amongst them was this guy, King Khama III. And so he was died in the wool prohibition. Actually, a lot of these native African tribes were prohibitionists because they saw how these colonial settlers would come in, they would get their young men addicted to alcohol, and then they would drink themselves into a grave. It would just decimate their populations. And so as the leader, they were trying to defend not only their sovereignty, their territory, but also prohibition, right? Through temperance. And so Khama was probably the most well-known of these. And I'm trying to fast forward with some of these. And so he was facing off against this guy here. This is Cecil Rhodes, the embodiment of imperialism, sort of this white man's burden thing, is a racist, right? So he believed in the superiority of the white race and wanted to dominate everybody else. So he didn't make, any sort of qualms about this sort of thing. But also, as we know, he kind of had this idea of making he wanted to build a rail link from Cape Town to Cairo, right? That was the big thing. And what's between Cape Town and Cairo? Well, this big area of the Serengeti known as Bechuanaland. And so he kept pushing and to incorporate these tribes, including Khama's tribes, into what was known as the British South Africa Company. And so it was a company, it was a colony, right? And the colonies are not just there for people to move to, it's there to extract profit. That's what colonies are about, right? So same with the British South Africa Company. Think about in the United States, you had, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established by the Massachusetts Bay Company to make money for their shareholders back in London, right? It's not just about moving people from point A to point B, it's about extracting resources, and it always has been. And so you end up having, Cecil Rhodes wants to fold that area in, have more and more area under his British South Africa Company. And King Khama and his tribesmen, including Bathian and Sebele, these other kings, they're not having it. They're pushing back as hard as they can for sovereignty and also for sobriety. And so what they end up doing, 1895, is that they kind of do like an end around. They say, okay, we're not getting anywhere with this, Cecil Rhodes. We'll go and talk to the boss. We're going to go talk to the Queen. And so these three guys get on a boat and they go to Great Britain, and they want to go have a meeting with Queen Victoria to show that they are, again, loyal subjects of the British Empire, but please, whatever you do, don't let us become part of that British South Africa Company, because they're going to take away not only our land, they're going to take away our sobriety, and they're going to enslave us. And so they get to England, just kind of fast forwarding with some of this here. And like it was what they call the silly season in London. It was August, September, everybody's gone on vacation. So there's nobody to talk to in the government. And so they go on like this tour, this temperance tour of all these churches around the British Isles, and really gin up a lot of support for them. And eventually at the end of the day, they meet with the Foreign Secretary, Chamberlain, and they get their wish. That they will be placed, what is known as Bechuanaland will be placed under the sovereignty of the crown, but not under the British South Africa Company. And this, do not let them bring liquor into our country to kill our people speedily. That was kind of the idea. So they win. They ultimately get their sovereignty. And so they're very, very happy. You can't tell from this photograph on this whole thing. They go and they meet Queen Victoria afterwards, the great white queen, as she was known in the colonial world. And so Sebele didn't realize he wasn't supposed to say this, says, Her Majesty is a very charming old lady, but I had no idea she was so short and stout. But I shall go back home contented, right? So a nice fat little lady, right? So anyway, so this does not sit well with Cecil Rhodes, who fired off one angry telegram after another to the colonial office, saying that he was, I do object to being beaten by these canting natives on the score of temperance. And then he uses language that I won't use to describe his defeat. So at the end of the day, this is one of the reasons why, these guys are like the founding fathers of Botswana, is that they were able to save not only the territory, but also sort of the prohibition in Botswana, and they're on the 100 Pula note of Botswana as associated with that. So yeah. So that's one. I know I want to wrap up here really quick because I've already been talking too much, but I did want to talk about Southeast Pennsylvania as well, because you have those same dynamics here as well. And so this is the federal government and liquor traffic by this guy William E. Pussyfoot Johnson. He's one of the fascinating guys. I'm writing his biography next. That is literally what I'm working on next. And I can tell you more about him. But he wrote this book, and he was the chief special officer of the of Native Americans across the United States, and so he was the chief prohibition officer to protect Native American populations against what they called the white man's wicked water. And so he says, since the discovery of America, practically every Indian war with this fearful record of human suffering has been caused directly or indirectly by the traffic in intoxicating liquors. A drunken Indian commits an outrage upon which infuriated whites retaliated with similar outrage. Indians are robbed of their lands, their ponies, their blankets through being intoxicated with strong drink. In some variety of one of these transactions is found the germ of nearly every Indian slaughter that has disgraced the history of American colonization. And I could go through a lot of the, Indian wars. We could go to King Philip's War back in the 1600s, was essentially that sort of thing. I could talk about my hometown and area, which is the Midwest. We had Chief Black Hawk. We had the Black Hawk War, same dynamic associated with that. But what's interesting is the area that we live in here in southeastern Pennsylvania didn't have a lot of Native American wars with between settlers and whatnot. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that this area was colonized by Quakers. Well, first it was colonized by the Swedes, and then the Dutch, and then the English, and then so the Quakers came in, and the Swedes, the Dutch, and the English were doing the same sort of thing. They were trying to get Native American populations, drunk for profit and extracting all sorts of profit from. William Penn wanted to live peacefully and coexist peacefully with the native populations. And so one of the first things that he does as part of his great laws is that he sits down with Native American leaders and says, what do you want? What would help you and us to get along better? And they said, across the board, stop selling us liquor, stop selling our people liquor and debauching us and making a huge profit off of this. And so this becomes part, and he takes this to heart, this becomes part of his great laws. And so if you go back and read the great laws from the 1600s for Pennsylvania, yeah, things like public intoxication, you get a bad, you're not supposed to do that. But he really brings sort of the fire and brimstone down for anybody who's a Quaker who tries to sell or trade alcohol to Native Americans, because you're getting other people addicted for your own benefit. And that is like the biggest red letter in all this sort of thing. And so what was fascinating, and so you have this interview with this Sachem, this chief, who explains, it says, what are your gripes with these white colonists who come in? And he says, these people that sell it, they are blind, they have no eyes. But now there is a people who have come to live amongst us, that they have eyes, and they see it they see it to be for our hurt, and we know it to be for our hurt. They are willing to deny themselves the profit of it for our own good. Talking about the Quakers. So these are the people that we can live with. The people who are not going to make profit off of our drunkenness and our misery. And so, so we must put it down by mutual consent. The cask must be sealed up and made fast by night in the light nor in the dark. We give you these 4 belts of wampum, which we would have you lay up safe, and to keep by you to be witness of this agreement that we will make with you. So the Native American leaders across the board wanted prohibition. This is actually becomes one of the foundational things a few years later. in terms of the first federal prohibition in the United States. And so, so if you look at a map of where there was war and where there was peace in the colonial United States between natives and white settlers, the areas that were predominantly populated by Quakers tended to be the most peaceful. And I guess the Catholics a little bit beyond that, because they weren't there to try to make money off of these native peoples. And so this Pennsylvania prohibition seemed to work fairly well. Prohibition, again, not against drinking, but against trading alcohol to Native Americans in particular, until you get to the Revolutionary War period. And so in the Revolutionary War, you get, you've got out at Valley Forge, which is, 7 miles from our house, is one of my favorite places to go and visit. You've got all of a sudden all these ragtag militias from all these states across the, up and down the colonies who are coming in. They don't know about the Quaker prohibition, and they're starting to trade liquor to Native Americans to make some money on the side. And this infuriates General George Washington so much that he institutes his own prohibition against trading, right? And so any persons, whatever, are forbid selling liquor to the Indians. If any sutler or soldier shall presume to act contrary to this prohibition, the former will be dismissed from camp and the latter receive such severe corporal punishment. And so he goes on, actually, instituted prohibition around the camp, around any sort of military activities, and really would court-martial anyone who adulterated their liquors in order to get soldiers drunk and take advantage of them. And so, so again, just kind of getting to this, the grander point of this whole thing is that a lot of the individuals, when we've vilified prohibitionists as being against freedom and against, your ability to imbibe, it's incredible how many of our founding fathers were actually prohibitionists. In fact, you can look at every single member of the guys on Mount Rushmore. I can make an argument that all 4 of them are prohibitionists in one way or the other. So yeah, this is kind of the foundations of it. And so when you start to look at this, to look at, I guess, history from this kind of global perspective, and then look at the United States, again, you find the second half of the book is about Native Americans. It's about African Americans who tended to be, incredibly strong, temperance advocates, again, in the 1840s, 1850s, and, straight through to the 19-teens as well. Linkages with the suffragist movement, obviously, linkages with gospel socialism, the social gospel, as it were, with the labor movement, and ultimately progressivism as well. And so that's kind of how the book kind of culminates into, culminates with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. And so it looks through a lot of history in a way that we're not used to seeing it. And at some point, and I was just writing about this the other day, the books, I used to have this idea that the people who wrote big books, that they had a lot on their mind, that they had like this wealth of knowledge. This isn't really that. This isn't, I didn't know any of this before I started digging into it. This is just like a journey, and I'm taking people along with me and trying to chronicle, this whole thing. And at some point I started to get angry that, why don't we know this? Why isn't this common knowledge already? Why don't we have all this information? And that became, sort of the focus of the entire book there. So anyway, I know I've completely overrun my my time, but I'm happy to stick around and talk as late as you want, and answer whatever questions that you might have as well. So, yep. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of that. Yeah, I would say if anybody has to leave right now, feel free, but we're also happy to stick around and take some questions if folks have them. So if there are any, give people a second to leave who have to.
Yeah.
And then raise some hands and I'll come around and give you the microphone if you have questions.
On one level, this is kind of a stupid question, but I noticed the last 3, the ones about William Penn and George Washington and someone else, down in the lower left corner, there was a Topps bubblegum card logo.
Yeah.
So can you get Prohibition cards?
No, I just made them.
Oh, you just
They're 1987 Topps baseball cards.
Okay.
Because I've got 8,000 of those. When I was a kid, I was told that they're going to be worth a lot of money, and now they're worth absolutely
Okay.
nothing.
Okay,
But,
well, you thought no one would notice
Yeah.
that, but I noticed it.
But yeah, I've got, these tops. So, I got, you got Lewis and Clark,
I
But-
picked up on that about 2/3 of the way through.
It also helps me. So like, if I just had pictures of them, I would forget names. I'm like, oh, who is that guy? Now I just have them right there and how to pronounce them. So.
So being a political scientist, I was very interested in your opening statement about you're interested in history, but you're studying it from a political science perspective.
Mhm.
So one of the things about political science is you had to have started with a null hypothesis that you're investigating, and you've adopted some methodologies that would allow you to investigate that. Could you talk a little bit about the political science methodology that's in the book?
Yeah, it's just it's not nothing all that complex. I mean, it's just comparative analysis. But the idea was that we're just trying to get as large a sample size as possible, because the way that they traditionally do it in history is that there's no consideration of things like sample size. And so as I mentioned, usually we have one sample. It's called the United States, and we kind of export all this information to other situations. I will tell you, like, one quick anecdote. I was giving a presentation kind of based upon early steps of this, in London and to this international conference. And I met this woman who had been studying she's from Mexico. And so she teaches in Mexico City. And she was taken aback by like some of these findings, this new perspective. And she's like, I just got done writing my doctoral dissertation on why it is that in Mexico in 1917, they have a new constitution, and it is the most progressive constitution the world had seen until that point. Very, very progressive. It has, equal rights, women can vote, all the stuff in constant there, but there's also a measure against the liquor traffic, right? So it's like a quasi prohibitionism. How did that get in there? That was her focus. And so she picks up, interested in these questions of prohibitionism, and figuring the United States, well, Americans must know their own history very, very well. And so they kind of picks up on this thing that says, oh, well, prohibition is about, conservative Bible thumping evangelicals. That's what causes prohibition. So she wrote her entire dissertation looking for Bible thumping prohibitionist evangelicals, like missionaries in Mexico, which is a predominantly Catholic country, right? And found like a couple, but certainly not enough to get anything ensconced into a new constitution. And so she's like, if I would have known this, and you were just, weren't exporting this kind of misguided hypothesis about what causes prohibition, I could have saved like 3 years of my research, and probably would have done something else with my life. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I wish we had a time machine to go back. But, so that was the idea. It's like, okay, I want to get as broad a sample as possible, and to see if this actually holds water. And so that's, at the end of the book, I kind of return to sort of the political sciencey stuff. And I say, look, at the end of the day, I think I've got a pretty good explanation for what's going on here. I've got a lot of research, but that doesn't mean that my hypothesis is not falsifiable. Other people could come up and they could do additional research. They could find stuff that invalidates this. And that's how we learn, and that's how we grow, and that's how social science goes. And so I'm fine with that. It's like we're just kind of moving the ball down the field, as it were.
In your research, was the 18th Amendment the first law ever written on prohibition, or were there other countries that had ventured into actually documenting the law?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the first prohibitionist country, if you want to do sort of a chronology, would be Imperial Russia. They beat the United States. They had it as a wartime measure in 1914. So they beat the United States by 5 years. But the argument that I make in the book is that we focus so much on the 18th Amendment as like the first federal prohibition. Actually, the first federal prohibition was in 1802, coming from this guy over here. This is the signing of the Treaty of Greenville, which is in Ohio. This is Chief Little Turtle of the Miami tribe. He ends up, and this is General Mad Anthony Wayne. I live just outside of Wayne, PA, right? So, so they've got their baseball cards there too. And so he and his assistant, this guy William Wells, makes common cause with the Quakers in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and to get them on their side about sort of prohibiting the liquor trade to Native Americans. And they all go down to Washington, D.C. and meet up with, with President Jefferson. And President Jefferson listens to these concerns and thinks that it's actually a very good idea that, all these native tribes, they don't want these white settlers, messing things up. So we should institute a federal prohibition against the white man trading liquor to native populations in those areas that are not, I guess what they call Indian territory, right? So the areas that are outside of state or territorial designation. And so from 1802, that's why you had this constant prohibition in all these areas. And of course, these things get smaller and smaller as you have more states added to the Union and whatnot. But yeah, if you look at it through this way, the first federal prohibition was in 1802.
So Mark, I'm coming from a medical background, and so today in the Journal of American Medical Association, they said 29 million Americans admit to having alcohol use disorder. It's alcohol use is the third most common cause of death in the U.S. after cancer and heart disease. Probably 90% of us in this room like to drink, and I like to drink, and brandy supposedly is medicinal. But with all your research globally, you focused on wars and rape and all these other things. Did any other countries, obviously the science had to evolve, but address prohibition from a public health perspective?
Yeah, and that's I think chapter 15, 16 starts to get into that. Focus more on the United States aspect, but as part of that kind of progressive movement, you started to have more of this idea of scientific analysis, right? And so you ended up having, a lot of these old superstitions that we used to have about alcohol. The old one that you can go back to like Montesquieu back in the day says, well, why do people drink liquor in colder climates? Well, because it warms the body. It's a stimulant. Oh, no, it's not. It depresses, which is why people get hypothermia when they go out and drink and fall asleep in a snowbank and die. In Russia, right? So I always have to throw that out in Russia. And so that was part of like this this movement in like the late 1800s, early 1900s about the era of prohibition. Is you're starting to get sort of social scientific data on sort of looking at comparative outcomes. And the United States was great for this, by the way. You ended up having researchers from around the globe would come to the United States and say, okay, well, look, we have some states are dry. We have prohibition states. We have what they talked about as high license states where they would, put a tax on alcohol sales. They had other states like South Carolina had like a municipal dispensary system that was run by the state. And they're like, oh, well, we can measure these outcomes and see what the health outcomes look like in a prohibition state versus a sort of a free trade state or state control. So you ended up having like that social scientific data, but also sort of these new insights from the medical community. And what really was fascinating is how this gets wrapped up, especially with insurance agencies, right? The idea that you start to have people, and it starts in transportation with the railroads in particular, that they would only hire people who were temperate because they were less likely to get in an accident, they were less likely to run the train off the tracks, and would pay, I guess, lower premiums for that sort of thing to incentivize people to have a more healthy lifestyle in that sort of way. So even those things that I think is kind of more akin to sort of modern alcohol control policies, you have some of those antecedents back in this time period as well. Yeah.
You make the distinction between liquor traffic and those who drink. It seems to me that once prohibition went into effect in this country, it essentially stifled socialization and socializing. The trafficking you've applied to American Indians, to suppressed people, but this essentially stopped Americans from being allowed to do something that was very social and very cultural for many people. How do you explain that?
Yeah, like I said, a lot of it is the suggestion was like for prohibition, it's like after prohibition gets instituted, and people would say, look, you're taking away these hubs of the community, and you're taking away all these sorts of things, so some people, I guess, on the more realistic angle, we're saying, well, people are going to keep drinking, in their speakeasies or out back or wherever it is that they're doing it, by their own right. But other ones were just more, I guess, Machiavellian in this way, and they would say, well, you can't, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, and that's okay. It's an acceptable loss if the gains are going to be, no more, or at least I should say less of that kind of capitalization or taking advantage of one person by another. They were okay with it. They were okay with shutting these things down. And some of the more, I guess, say rabid, sort of temperance voices were actively promoting sort of all the benefits, right? Okay, so we're going to get rid of this thing called the saloon, which is awful and icky and all that sort of stuff. But we're going to get like increases in economic productivity, people not coming to work drunk and all these sorts of things. But I will say one thing about this, about, the old saloon, is that, and this is something I write in the very end of the book, is that we have, these organizations, the temperance organizations. Probably the most famous one in the United States was the Anti-Saloon League. And that, I think that the phrasing is very important because they were against the saloon. They were not like the anti-leisure drinking society. They were against the place which was doing a lot of the debauching. And nowadays we have this idea of the saloon. We think about, the visual that immediately pops to mind is like some Wild West canteen with the swinging doors, and you kick them open and you order a whiskey and stuff like that. Or, that kind of romantic notion. But saloons back in the day, I think, are fundamentally different than like bars, pubs, and stuff that we have nowadays. I think what we're used to, and I call this I do this a lot. I make like these little flippant things. And so I called it the Ted Danson effect. I said, well, we kind of associate, the saloons of old with Ted Danson's character on Cheers. Here's the bartender. He's here to, at the end of a long day to give you a beer and to listen to your troubles. And then when you're done, he's going to pack you up into a cab and send you on your way home. And that's a very, very nice kind of sanitized version. That was not the saloon back in the day. And it certainly wasn't the kabak in Russia. And it wasn't the Schnapshola in Germany, or, some of these places in South Africa. The saloon was there to take your money completely. That was the idea. And these were unregulated. So the thing that really these were dark places that you go into and you drink until, nobody's going to pack you up and send you home because you've had too much, because that's profit that they're losing at the end of the day. And so what really gets me is, I'll go back to Carrie Nation here. One of my favorite characters, and that is one of the reasons I she's in the introduction to the book, because we kind of mischaracterize her. So she was famous for going into Kansas in the year 1900, started smashing up saloons in Kiowa, Kansas, and then throughout Kansas. Becomes this international celebrity for her saloon smashing. Does anybody want to take a guess at like what time of day Carrie Nation was going in and smashing saloons and setting all the drunkards to flight? Yeah. Any guesses as to particular times? That's exactly right. She was in smashing saloons at 7 a.m. every morning. She was usually in jail by 7:30. But the idea was that those people who were drinking had been there all night, because there was no closing hours. These were people, again, they get their hooks into them. And the saloon keeper was not there to, again, sort of pack you on. The saloon keeper was usually not only selling liquor, but it was also usually running prostitution rings, gambling dens, and was usually the community pawnbroker as well. So if you were drinking and drinking and drinking, and then you ran out of money, they would pawn whatever you had of wealth. They would take it from you, right? And so that's why, like things like the Anti-Saloon League were really focused on the saloon, because the saloon was an awful place, and not just by members of like the temperance organizations, but sort of more general, sort of accounts. They're like, yeah, this is kind of a blight on society. And there was I don't know, maybe I have it I don't know if I had it in this one. No, there's Carrie Nation. Oh, so even at the end of the day, you even had, this is the thing that really hit it out of the ballpark. When I was giving this talk the other day to a bunch of brewery CEOs, and they said, this is from this quote here at the bottom. from 1908, so still 10 years before the 18th Amendment. It says, we dislike to acknowledge it, but we really believe that the entire business all over has overstayed the opportunity to protect itself against the onward march of prohibition, admitted J.E. Nolan, the editor of Beverages, the official publication of the National Liquor League. So the liquor traffic is like, I think we may have gone too far. I don't think this is good. I think they may actually have a point that we're in the wrong on this. And so 5 years ago, a united industry may have kept back the situation that now confronts it. But today it is too late. We might as well try to keep out the Hudson River with a whisk broom than to stop these prohibitionists. And so, yeah, and just one like a final point on this, I think a lot of conventional prohibition histories focus on the prohibitionists. Like they are just pushing against, well, we don't even talk about like the liquor industry. They're just kind of out there like this innocent party that we don't talk about. This one tries to focus more on, again, sort of the liquor machine, the liquor traffic, and sort of the internal fissures between brewers and distillers, and how these how they were trying to confront what they saw as the threat of these temperance organizations. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, and it really kind of, like I said, when I was giving this talk to a bunch of brewers, international brewers, like this isn't going to fly particularly well with them, but they were okay with it because they're like, brewing seemed to be sort of the less nefarious, and they felt like they had been improperly tied in with the liquor dealers and the whiskey dealers at that point.
Any final? I got one more question.
Actually, I have two. When did we begin to pass laws as far as the restriction of age in the use of alcohol?
There were actually, it goes way back, depending on how you look at it. Actually, you can go back to colonial history. There were age restrictions and also restrictions about who could and who could not drink, including Native Americans could not drink in taverns and saloons. So it actually has a fairly deep history in the United States. Not so much in Russia. 2009 in Russia, so fairly recent.
Then the other thought that sort of wandered through my mind is, if people were giving alcohol for the purpose of enslavement or whatever, make money in them, being a little bit of a devil advocate here, the way the state of Pennsylvania has set up their control, as well as other states making money on this. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating historical continuity. And again, when I was talking with the brewers, we're like, we've seen this all before. This is all the same stuff, but a century later in time. But that was amongst the temperance, American temperance organizations, there was a big fissure between what they talked about as alcohol control states, and one of the chapters on Sweden in particular is one of the areas where they had sort of government monopolization. They took away, the idea was behind a lot of these situations was in Sweden, they had this thing called the Gothenburg system after the city in which it was developed. They entrusted the alcohol trade to like the most trustworthy sort of entrepreneurs in the town. They promised they would take 5% profit as part of their investment. Everything else would be folded back into the community. And so by removing the profit motive to get people drunk because you're making money off of it, they found that like alcoholism declined, all sorts of social benefits came out as well. You had this kind of blossoming of civil society. And so you ended up having, not just before Prohibition, but especially after Prohibition, a lot of American states were patterning. That's how we get these state liquor stores. I'm from Iowa. We still have state liquor stores as well. Was the same idea that we want to remove the profit motive from it, but doesn't that also give the state level a profit, an interest in revenue, in raising revenue? And so again, going back to the old temperance organizations, there was a deep split between people who wanted to take sort of the more modern harm mitigation approach that's more associated with alcohol control policies, and then sort of the I guess might call hardcore prohibitionists who are like, no, we cannot cooperate. That's getting in bed with the devil's business, and we have to have absolute prohibition. So that was a big fissure between them back then, and now as well. And you see it even because there's still temperance. They're still out there, and it's not so much about alcohol, but about a lot of these similar sort of addictive behaviors that the state profits from. And so alcohol, marijuana, you know, gambling, yeah, tobacco. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's the same dynamic as, you know, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate. I think everybody has their different kind of stance on where they see themselves.
Any final questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Mark, for joining us, and thank
Thank
you all
you.
for studying.
It was a lot of fun.